Congressman Byron thought he could embarrass Jasmine Crockett with a simple laugh during the House Financial Services Committee hearing. The Florida Republican's smug chuckle echoed through the chamber as the Texas Democrat finished her opening statement about banking inequalities. But what happened in the next 30 seconds completely wiped that smile off his face and left the entire room in stunned silence. Donalds leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, that familiar confident grin spreading across his face. He'd dealt with progressive Democrats before. At 44, the two-term congressman from Naples had built his reputation on dismantling liberal arguments with conservative logic. Crockett, just 43 and serving her second term, seemed like an easy target. After all, she was a former public defender from Dallas talking about systemic banking issues to a room full of financial experts. The moment that laugh left his lips, cameras caught everything in devastating detail. Donald shaking his head dismissively, his gold wedding ring glinting as he gestured toward Crockett with barely concealed disdain. Committee members shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs, sensing the temperature change in the room. Republican staffers in the gallery exchanged worried glances, recognizing that their colleague had just stepped into dangerous territory. And Crockett's face, captured in perfect high definition by C-SPAN's unforgiving cameras, transforming from professional composure to something far more dangerous. The kind of expression that trial lawyers develop when they realize their opponent has just handed them the case. She set down her prepared notes with deliberate precision, looked directly at Donalds with the focused intensity of a predator who'd found her prey, and said words that would trend on social media within minutes and define both of their careers forever. The tension in that committee room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Democratic staffers leaned forward in their seats, sensing something big was about to happen. Republican aides frantically checked their phones, probably already drafting damage control statements. Even the usually bored C-SPAN camera operators seemed more alert, instinctively knowing they were about to capture television gold. What made this moment even more explosive was a history between these two rising stars. Donalds and Crockett had clashed before in smaller committee hearings, but never with this level of national attention. Their opposing styles, his smooth corporate confidence versus her courtroom fire, had been building toward this confrontation for months. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and smash that subscribe button so you never miss these incredible political showdowns that everyone's talking about. To understand why this moment became so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two powerhouse politicians are and why this committee hearing mattered so much. Byron Donalds represents everything the Republican Party loves to showcase. Born in Brooklyn but raised in Florida, he's a black conservative who climbed from insurance sales to the halls of Congress. At 44, he's married with 3 children, a devout Christian, and someone who never backs down from a fight. Donalds made national headlines when he ran for Speaker of the House, gaining support from the Freedom Caucus. He's appeared on Fox News countless times, always ready with sharp comebacks and conservative talking points. His philosophy is simple: personal responsibility over government handouts, free markets over regulation. That day, Donald sat confidently in his navy blue suit, gold wedding ring catching committee room lights. He prepared for this hearing like he prepared for every battle, with facts, figures, and the absolute certainty that progressive Democrats would crumble under logical questioning. Banking inequality? Please. He'd built his own financial services business before entering politics. He knew these issues inside and out. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th district, covering parts of Dallas. At 43, she's a former public defender who spent years fighting for people the system tried to forget. Before Congress, she served in the Texas House, where she quickly gained a reputation for fiery speeches and refusing to back down from anyone. Crockett didn't just study law. She lived it, defending clients who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, seeing firsthand how the system failed working families. That morning, Crockett wore a sharp black blazer that seemed to absorb the harsh committee room lighting, her signature hoop earrings catching the light as she reviewed her notes one final time. Every detail of her appearance had been carefully chosen. The professional but approachable styling that said, "I belong here," without sacrificing the authenticity that connected her to her constituents back in Dallas. She'd spent weeks preparing for this hearing, not with talking points crafted by consultants, but with real stories collected during town halls in church basements and community centers across her district. Families denied mortgages despite pristine credit histories. Small businesses shut out of lending programs designed to help them grow. Veterans who'd served their country with honor, only to find themselves unable to access basic banking services because algorithms flagged their government benefits as unstable income. This was an academic policy discussion for her. It was deeply personal, representing the lived experiences of people who trusted her with their vote and their hopes for a better future. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The House Financial Services Committee was reviewing new banking regulations that could affect millions of Americans. Democratic members wanted stronger oversight to prevent discrimination. Republicans argued that excessive regulation would hurt economic growth and limit access to credit. With control of the House hanging in the balance for future elections, every hearing became a battleground for competing visions of America. The room buzzed with anticipation. Committee Chairman Patrick McHenry had already warned members to keep things professional. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle. Financial reporters filled the press gallery, knowing that any fireworks would make headlines. Both parties had their rising stars on display, ready to create viral moments that would play on social media for days. Donalds had spent the morning reviewing his talking points with his chief of staff, confident that he could handle any progressive challenge. His media training had taught him to stay calm, stick to conservative principles, and never let Democrats control the narrative. He'd successfully debated senators, governors, and cable news hosts. A second-term congresswoman from Dallas? This should be easy. But Donalds had made a critical error in preparation. He'd researched Crockett's voting record and policy positions, but he completely underestimated her background as a trial lawyer. He saw public defender and thought bleeding heart liberal. He didn't see courtroom warrior who'd spent 15 years destroying overconfident opponents who underestimated her. Crockett, meanwhile, had done her homework differently. She didn't just study Donalds' positions. She studied his personality, his media appearances, his tendency toward condescension when challenged by women or people of color. She watched hours of his Fox News interviews, noting how he used dismissive laughter as a weapon to diminish opponents. She was ready for exactly this moment. The committee room itself told the story of American power dynamics. The marble walls, the formal portraits of past committee chairs, all white men until recently. The elaborate desk setup that made members look like judges presiding over financial destiny. For Crockett, walking into that room every day was a reminder of how many barriers had been broken just to get her voice heard. For Donalds, it represented the pinnacle of conservative achievement, a black Republican at the highest levels of power. The Financial Services Committee hearing started like dozens of others, boring, procedural, filled with prepared statements that most Americans would never hear. But tensions had been building for weeks between progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans over banking inequality issues. Crockett had been waiting for this moment. Her opening statement wasn't just policy talk. It was a moral argument that cut straight to the heart of American economic justice. She spoke about Maria Gonzalez, a single mother from her district who'd been denied a small business loan despite perfect credit, while a white applicant with worse credentials got approved the same day. She talked about elderly black veterans unable to open basic checking accounts because banks claimed their government benefits weren't stable income. This isn't about handouts, Crockett said, her voice rising with passion. This is about equal access to the financial system that makes the American dream possible. When banks use algorithms that perpetuate historical discrimination, we're not just talking about business decisions. We're talking about economic apartheid. That's when Donalds made his first mistake. The laugh started as a quiet chuckle, the kind of dismissive sound that says, "Here we go again with the victim narrative." But his microphone picked it up, and C-SPAN cameras caught his head shake, and I rolled perfectly. Committee members shifted uncomfortably. Even Republicans looked surprised by the obvious disrespect. Chairman McHenry leaned forward, clearly preparing to restore order if things escalated. Crockett paused mid-sentence, her eyes locking onto Donalds like a laser sight, finding its target. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying that dangerous calm that every lawyer learns. Did something about economic discrimination against black and brown families strike you as funny, Congressman Donalds? Donalds realized his mistake immediately, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He leaned toward his microphone, that confident grin still playing at the corners of his mouth. What I find amusing, Congresswoman Crockett, is this constant need to blame systemic racism for every economic disparity instead of addressing real issues like financial literacy and personal responsibility. The room erupted. Democratic members started talking over each other. Republican staffers began frantically typing on their phones, knowing this was about to go viral for all the wrong reasons. But Donalds wasn't finished. His voice carried that smooth confidence that had made him a Fox News favorite. I built businesses. I've worked in financial services. I've seen how these programs actually work, not just a cherry-pick stories designed to advance a political agenda. Maybe instead of playing victim, we should focus on teaching people how to build wealth and make better financial decisions. The condescension dripped from every word. The suggestion that Crockett, a Harvard-educated lawyer and former public defender, didn't understand real issues hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Democratic members looked stunned. Even some Republicans winced at the tone. But Donald seemed energized by the reaction, feeding off the tension like a performer who'd found his rhythm. And frankly, he continued, his voice gaining strength, I find it interesting that we're hearing lectures about banking inequality from someone whose own district has some of the highest crime rates in Texas. Maybe if we focus on making communities safer, banks would be more willing to invest there. But there was something else happening in that moment that the cameras couldn't fully capture. The generational and ideological divide that split black political leadership in America. Here were two successful African Americans who'd reached the highest levels of government, yet they represented completely different philosophies about how to achieve progress and justice. Donalds represented the bootstrap conservative approach. Work hard, follow the rules, don't make excuses, and the system will reward merit. His success story was real. From Brooklyn streets to Congress, building businesses and wealth through determination and conservative principles. Crockett embodied the systemic change progressive approach, acknowledged that the system has built-in barriers, fight to remove those obstacles, and ensure that individual success stories don't obscure ongoing injustices that affect millions. Their clash wasn't just about banking policy. It was about fundamentally different views of how America works and what government should do about persistent inequalities. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Two black politicians arguing about whether systemic racism still significantly impacts economic opportunity, while sitting in a committee room where they were among the first African Americans ever to hold such positions of power. The pause stretched for what felt like an eternity. Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. Donalds maintained his confident posture, apparently satisfied with his performance. Chairman McHenry started to call for order, but Crockett raised one finger, a gesture so slight and controlled that it commanded instant attention from everyone in the room. The psychological dynamics of that moment were fascinating to watch. Donalds, accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, had clearly expected Crockett to respond defensively to his attacks. His body language suggested complete confidence, leaning back, arms crossed, that slight smile suggesting he was enjoying the intellectual combat. But Crockett's response revealed years of courtroom experience dealing with exactly this type of opponent. She'd faced down prosecutors, judges, and defense attorneys who thought they could intimidate or outsmart her. Her stillness wasn't uncertainty. It was a predatory calm of someone calculating exactly how to dismantle an overconfident adversary. The generational divide was also crucial. At 44 and 43 respectively, both politicians represented a new generation of leaders who'd grown up in the social media age. They understood that moments like this wouldn't just be reported in newspapers. They'd be clipped, shared, memed, and analyzed by millions of people within hours. Donald seemed to forget this reality in his moment of perceived triumph. His comfortable grin suggested he thought he was winning a private debate, not performing for a global audience that would judge every expression, every gesture, every word. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to the Congressman's observations. What happened next became the most watched congressional hearing clip of the entire year. Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond to Byron Donalds. She systematically dismantled them with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a woman who'd heard these talking points her entire career. She stood up slowly, deliberately, her black blazer sharp against the committee room's beige backdrop. Every camera in the room focused on her face as she began speaking in that controlled, measured tone that trial lawyers use when they're about to destroy a witness. Congressman Donalds, I want to thank you for that illuminating response. It perfectly demonstrates exactly why we need stronger banking regulations and oversight. Donalds shifted in his seat, his confident smile wavering slightly. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't going to be the defensive reaction he'd expected. You see what you just did, dismissing legitimate concerns about discrimination as playing victim, while simultaneously suggesting that communities with higher crime rates somehow deserve less access to financial services. That's not just bad policy. That's exactly the kind of thinking that created these disparities in the first place. Her voice began to rise, each word carefully chosen and delivered with devastating effect. You want to talk about financial literacy? Let's talk about it. I represent a district where the average household income is $45,000 a year. You represent a district where it's $65,000. I represent communities that were literally redlined for decades, where banks refuse to make loans based on zip codes alone. You represent some of the wealthiest communities in Florida, where generational wealth has been protected and preserved for centuries. Donalds tried to interrupt, leaning toward his microphone, but Crockett cut him off with the authority of someone who'd spent years controlling courtrooms. I'm not finished, Congressman. You had your time to laugh and lecture. Now it's my turn. The room fell completely silent. Even the stenographer seemed to pause, fingers hovering over keys. You want to discuss personal responsibility? Let's discuss it. I worked my way through college and law school. I spent 15 years as a public defender, representing people who couldn't afford attorneys, fighting a system that was stacked against them from day one. I've seen what happens when banks use objective criteria that somehow always seem to disadvantage the same communities. She pulled out a folder from her briefcase, her movements precise and controlled. Since you brought up my district, let me share some facts. In the past 5 years, banks in your district approved 78% of small business loan applications. In my district, 23%. Same credit scores, same business plans, same collateral. The only difference? Zip codes and demographics. Donalds' face began to flush. His communications director, watching from the staff area, started typing furiously on her phone, probably crafting damage control statements. But Crockett wasn't finished. She was just getting started. You mentioned crime statistics, as if poverty and lack of economic opportunity have nothing to do with crime rates, as if communities that have been systematically denied access to capital and investment for generations should somehow magically transform overnight. Her voice carried the passion of every closing argument she'd ever delivered, every client she'd ever defended, every family she'd ever fought for. Let me tell you about Maria Gonzalez, the woman I mentioned earlier. She applied for a $50,000 loan to expand her catering business. Perfect credit score, 780. 5 years of profitable operation. But the algorithm flagged her application as high risk because of her address. That same week, a restaurant in your district, owned by a donor to your campaign, by the way, got approved for $200,000 with a 720 credit score. The gasps were audible. Even Republican members looked uncomfortable as Crockett pulled out specific documents. Oh, you didn't know I'd done my homework, Congressman? You thought you could laugh at my concerns and dismiss my constituent struggles with your talking points about personal responsibility? Donalds tried again to speak, but Chairman McHenry, seeing the explosive nature of what was unfolding, gestured for silence. Crockett's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in to hear her words. But here's what really bothers me about your response, Congressman Donalds. You're a black man. You know, or you should know, what it feels like to be judged, dismissed, and underestimated. Yet here you sit, laughing at other people's struggles, repeating the same rhetoric that was used to justify discrimination against our grandparents. The impact was devastating. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Democratic members looked stunned by the directness of the attack. Even some Republicans shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this had moved far beyond typical political sparring. You built businesses? Congratulations. You know what my constituents could build if they had the same access to capital, the same networks, the same opportunities that you've enjoyed. They could build generational wealth instead of just trying to survive paycheck to paycheck. She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering her knockout punch. And since you brought up my background and qualifications, let me remind you of something. I didn't inherit my seat. I didn't get here because of family connections or political favors. I earned it by fighting for people who needed a voice. Every day, in courtrooms across Texas, defending clients that lawyers like you wouldn't even take meetings with. Donald's confident smile had completely disappeared. His hands fidgeted with his pen, his eyes darting between Crockett and the cameras that were capturing every moment of his dismantling. So when you laugh at my concerns about banking inequality, you're not just laughing at me. You're laughing at Maria Gonzalez. You're laughing at the veteran who can't get a car loan despite his service record. You're laughing at the young family trying to buy their first home in a system designed to keep them as permanent renters. She closed her folder and looked directly into the camera, speaking past Donald's to the millions of people she knew would watch this clip online. That's not the conservative values I grew up respecting. That's not the Republican Party that my grandfather supported. That's just cruelty disguised as policy. The silence that followed was deafening. Donald sat frozen, clearly unprepared for the systematic destruction of his position. Chairman McHenry looked like he wanted to call a recess, but couldn't figure out how to interrupt the moment. Finally, Crockett sat down, straightened her blazer, and spoke directly to Donald's one final time. Congressman, the next time you feel like laughing at someone's struggle, maybe take a moment to remember where you came from, and ask yourself, am I building bridges or just burning them? The committee room erupted. Democratic members applauded openly, violating typical decorum. Republican members sat in stunned silence. Donald stared at his notes, his political calculation machine working overtime to figure out how to recover from what everyone in the room knew was a career-defining moment, and not in a good way. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, phones across the committee room started buzzing like angry hornets. Staffers frantically typed. Reporters rushed to file breaking news alerts. Social media managers on both sides began preparing for the digital tsunami they knew was coming. Within minutes, hashtag Crockett Destroys Donald began trending on Twitter/X. The clip of her takedown, professionally edited by Democratic digital teams, started spreading across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube faster than wildfire in drought season. The immediate reactions told the whole story. Democratic members looked like they'd just witnessed a masterclass in political combat. Progressive commentators on social media exploded with praise. This is what fighting back looks like. Crockett just gave a lesson in how to handle condescending conservatives. That is how you defend your district and your people. But even more telling were the reactions from unexpected corners. Conservative commentators who typically defended Republican positions found themselves struggling to justify Donald's approach. A prominent Republican strategist tweeted, "There's defending conservative principles, and then there's whatever that was." Donald stepped in it big time. Byron Donalds tried to salvage the situation with a follow-up statement, but his voice lacked the confidence he displayed just minutes earlier. "I think the Congresswoman mischaracterized my comments," he said, shuffling through his notes. "I have great respect for her service and her district. My point was simply that we need comprehensive solutions that address root causes, not just symptoms." But the damage was done. His attempt at damage control sounded exactly like what it was: a politician trying to walk back comments that had been captured on camera and would live forever on the internet. Chairman McHenry, clearly eager to move past the explosive exchange, called for a brief recess. But the real action was happening online, where the clip was being shared, analyzed, and turned into memes at light speed. The numbers were staggering. Within the first hour, the original C-SPAN clip had been viewed over 100,000 times. Democratic social media accounts that reposted highlights saw engagement rates spike by 400%. Progressive fundraising platforms reported massive spikes in donations to Crockett's campaign and similar candidates nationwide. But the most devastating coverage came from unexpected sources. Fox News, typically friendly to Republican positions, struggled to defend Donalds' performance. A primetime host called it an unforced error that handed Democrats a perfect campaign commercial. Even more damaging was the analysis from conservative think tanks and Republican strategists who recognized immediately that Donalds had violated every rule of political engagement. You don't dismiss constituent struggles. You don't laugh at legitimate policy concerns. And you definitely don't get into debates about discrimination with a black woman lawyer who spent her career fighting those exact battles. The media ecosystem responded with unprecedented speed and intensity. Within the first 6 hours, the clip had been viewed over 500,000 times across all platforms. Cable news networks cleared their afternoon programming to analyze the exchange. Political podcasters rushed out emergency episodes. Comedy shows started writing material before the hearing had even ended. But the most interesting reactions came from unexpected corners of the political world. Several Republican women privately told reporters they were uncomfortable with Donalds' tone, even if they agreed with his policy positions. A former Republican congresswoman tweeted, "You can be conservative without being condescending. This ain't it." Progressive activists, meanwhile, found their new hero. Within hours, Jasmine Crockett for Senate hashtags started trending, even though she wasn't running for Senate. Fundraising platform ActBlue reported a 300% spike in donations to progressive candidates, with many donors specifically citing the hearing as their motivation. The financial services industry watched nervously as the clip spread. Bank executives who've been quietly lobbying against new regulations suddenly found themselves dealing with a PR nightmare. Several major banks issued statements the next day announcing new community investment initiatives, a clear attempt to get ahead of the negative publicity. Corporate America had learned that viral political moments could create real business consequences. The last thing any major bank wanted was to become the poster child for the type of discrimination Crockett had so passionately described. Meanwhile, Crockett's profile skyrocketed overnight. Speaking requests poured in from universities, civil rights organizations, and Democratic fundraising events nationwide. Her communications team reported interview requests from major networks, podcast hosts, and magazine profiles. But perhaps most importantly, the banking industry itself took notice. Within a week of the hearing, 3 major banks announced new initiatives to address lending disparities. 2 financial services companies updated their algorithmic lending criteria. While correlation doesn't prove causation, industry insiders acknowledged that the viral nature of Crockett's critique had forced uncomfortable conversations in boardrooms across the country. The political ramifications extended far beyond the 2 individuals involved. Democratic strategists immediately recognized the clip as a perfect example of how to respond to conservative attacks, with facts, passion, and moral authority. They began incorporating elements of Crockett's approach into talking points for candidates nationwide. Republican strategists, meanwhile, used the incident as a cautionary tale in candidate training sessions. The message was clear. Preparation matters, respect matters, and in the age of social media, every moment is potentially career-defining. 3 weeks after the hearing, polling in both districts reflected the impact. Crockett's approval ratings jumped 12 points, with significant increases among independent voters who admired her straight talk and refusal to back down. Donald saw his numbers drop 8 points, with focus groups specifically mentioning the hearing as a turning point in their perception of his character. The long-term implications became even clearer during subsequent committee hearings. Donald adopted a noticeably more subdued approach, rarely interrupting Democratic colleagues, and avoiding the confrontational style that had defined his earlier appearances. Crockett, meanwhile, emerged as a go-to voice for progressive Democrats on financial services issues, with colleagues regularly yielding time for her questioning and commentary. The incident also highlighted the changing dynamics of political communication in the social media age. Traditional media coverage, while significant, was dwarfed by the viral spread of user-generated content. Memes, reaction videos, and commentary from influencers drove far more engagement than newspaper editorials or television analysis. One particularly viral TikTok video created by a college student. Use the audio from Crockett's "Remember Where You Came From" line over footage of various political moments, garnering over 2 million views and inspiring dozens of copycat videos. The incident became required viewing in political science classes, communication programs, and law schools as an example of effective rhetoric under pressure. Harvard's Kennedy School included the exchange in their crisis communication curriculum, analyzing both Crockett's masterful response and Donald's strategic errors. But beyond the political implications, the hearing highlighted deeper issues about representation, respect, and the ongoing struggles for economic equality in America. Crockett's response resonated not just because of her rhetorical skill, but because she articulated frustrations that millions of Americans felt about being dismissed, patronized, and laughed at by people in positions of power. The banking and equality issues that sparked the original confrontation didn't disappear after the viral moment, but something fundamental had shifted in how these conversations happened. Crockett's passionate defense of her constituents elevated the conversation from abstract policy debates to human stories that voters could understand and relate to. Suddenly, banking discrimination wasn't just a wonky regulatory issue. It was about real families being denied the American dream because of zip codes and algorithms designed by people who'd never experienced economic uncertainty. Media coverage of financial services issues increased dramatically in the weeks following the hearing. Reporters who'd never covered banking policy found themselves investigating redlining practices and algorithmic bias. Local news stations across the country began examining lending patterns in their own communities, often finding disparities that had gone unreported for years. The ripple effects extended to academia as well. Business schools began incorporating the hearing footage into ethics courses, using it as a case study in corporate responsibility and unconscious bias. Law schools added it to their advocacy training programs, showing students how preparation and moral authority could overcome institutional disadvantages. International observers also took notice of the exchange, with foreign policy experts noting how viral congressional moments now shaped America's global image. European newspapers covered the incident as evidence of both America's persistent racial tensions and its capacity for dramatic political theater. The BBC ran a segment analyzing how social media had transformed congressional hearings from boring procedural events into must-watch entertainment that could instantly elevate unknown politicians to international recognition. While no single hearing moment can claim credit for legislative change, multiple sources acknowledge that the viral attention had made inaction politically costly for members of both parties. The story of Byron Donalds laughing at Jasmine Crockett became more than just a political moment. It became a case study in the power of preparation, the importance of respect, and the reality that in modern politics, every microphone is live and every moment matters. The lesson for politicians was clear. Underestimate your opponents at your own peril, especially when those opponents have spent years fighting battles much harder than anything Congress can dish out. For voters, the exchange provided a perfect example of the choice between representation styles, those who dismiss and diminish versus those who fight and defend. In an era when many Americans feel unheard and unseen by their government, Crockett's passionate advocacy offered a model of what responsive representation could look like. The final word belonged to Crockett herself, who addressed the viral moment in a local Dallas interview 2 weeks later. "I didn't go to Congress to become famous or create viral moments. I went to fight for people who needed someone in their corner. If that fight sometimes gets messy, sometimes gets personal, and sometimes makes people uncomfortable, well, that's the price of progress." And with that, she proved that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting even on national television, with receipts and the moral authority that comes from never forgetting where you came from or who sent you to fight. The incident also revealed the power dynamics of modern political theater. Traditional political wisdom suggested that members should avoid confrontational moments that might alienate moderate voters. But the viral nature of Crockett's response demonstrated that authentic passion and moral clarity could actually expand a politician's base. Polling conducted 2 months after the hearing showed that Crockett's favorability ratings had increased not just among Democrats, but among independent voters who appreciated her willingness to fight back and refusal to be talked down to. Focus groups specifically mentioned her defense of her constituents as evidence of the kind of representation they wanted from their own elected officials. The hearing also became a watershed moment for how political professionals approach congressional testimony. Democratic media consultants began advising clients to pull a Crockett when faced with dismissive opponents, meaning come prepared with specific facts, maintain moral authority, and never let condescension go unchallenged. Republican strategists, meanwhile, used the incident as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of treating all opponents with respect, regardless of their perceived experience or background. The long-term impact extended beyond individual careers to institutional change. The House Committee on Financial Services updated its decorum guidelines after the incident, though critics noted that the rules seemed designed more to prevent viral moments than to address the underlying disrespect that had created the confrontation in the first place. Most significantly, the incident highlighted how social media had fundamentally changed the stakes of political communication. A single moment of poor judgment could now define an entire career, while skillful response could launch a politician to national prominence overnight. Thanks for watching this incredible political showdown that proves why preparation and principle will always triumph over arrogance and assumptions. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these explosive moments that define American politics. Let us know in the comments. What did you think of Crockett's response? Was it justified or did she go too far? And which political showdown would you like us to cover next? We'll see you in the next video where we break down the latest political drama that has everyone talking.